So we finally got our last VR update, and this was planned to be the last VR update before Pokemon Home's release. But then, of course, we got the news that the small indie company known as TCPI, or TPCI, whatever the abbreviation is, managed to mess up, and Home is not coming tomorrow, or whatever, the following days after this video comes up. So maybe we'll have another update, but we still had this one, and we're going to go over it. Now, something to keep in mind is I do believe some of these updates are maybe a little bit living in the moment based on week 1 of in UPL, so maybe you disagree with a couple of them, I know I do, so it's just a little caveat to keep in mind. But let's go over it. There are also some comments I'll leave maybe on Mons I would have risen higher, because I think that's just nice knowledge to share with y'all. Let's start off. Whiscash, it got ranked B-. This mon is terrible, but it gets enough fringe usage to where I think ranking it somewhere decent is fine. It's hard to really deny the success that it has shown for certain users, even if I myself have consistently felt this mon to be really bad. It is another ground type, so it lets you experiment a little bit more with structures that don't include Sandaconda. I do think that is valuable. Dragon Dance is, okay enough. Yeah, you do need multiple boosts, but at the very least, Terra does help compensate somewhat for being really weak, as it just gives you that amped up power on what is generally Outrage with Terra Dragon. And then it's got a lot of nice utility moves, so there is a lot to experiment with. I mean, you've got both hazards. Stealth Rock plus Spikes is always going to have some use on a mon, whether it's as a hazard lead or just, staple some defensive EVs to it, give it a hazard move and call it a day. Future Sight is a move it learns. Do with that what you will. Yeah, it's not the worst Pokemon. Maybe B- was a little high, but I don't think it's too bad of a ranking. And we got a ton of Pokemon going up to S-. I think all of these are pretty good indicators of mons that are firmly solidifying themselves as the upper echelon options. Muck is just really consistent as a special wall. There aren't a ton of Pokemon that actually just come in and threaten to one-shot it. You're looking at something like, say, an Indeedee, maybe some physical attacker. Sandaconda being everywhere is always a problem, but you can always T-Spike on the switch and double out. You got things because you look at other physical attackers, and I know some of these are mons that dropped, but Mabostiff isn't one-shotting you because, Stakeout is necessary for it. So it's not going to get that. Berserker doesn't one-shot you. It does a lot. But it's a mon that you can play kind of greedily. And it's got a ton of utility that makes it really customizable based on your team's needs. Like I said, you've got T-Spikes. That's always a good move. You've got, Protox. That still finds its way onto teams. You've got Rest Talk. We've seen Zen Headbutt even pick up lately with someone in NUPL even opting for Terra Psychic. Terra Psychic, of course, doing a lot of the same things Terra Dark does, where you gain that Psychic resistance, but you also can amp up Zen Headbutt's damage. And why do you run Zen Headbutt? Well, 2 Pokemon. 1, Haunter, as you see that rose down here. It is nice to have a way to hit Haunter, because otherwise you're stuck with Poison Jab. And then the other option's Toxicroak. Both of those mons otherwise live rent-free in Muck's head, but with Zen Headbutt, you actually just completely flip the matchup. And then we have Rotom going up to S-. Again, this should come as a surprise to no one. Any Sandaconda that doesn't have Stone Edge, or a rock move in general, is giving free turns to Rotom. Scarf Rotom is another, pivot that can run Scarf very, very effectively, and unlike Scyther, it isn't struggling with a Stealth Rock weakness, which is really nice. Trick plus Will-O-Wisp giving you all that utility to shut down Eel and in general bother potential answers like Muck, maybe a greedy Sandaconda coming in, Cacturn, Appleton, etc. And in Nasty Plot, a set that I've shilled for months now, or at least a month. Just a very, very potent setup sweeper, because a lot of the mons that come in versus you don't like dealing with Terra Fairy, or they just don't like having to deal with you when you're behind a sub, because yeah, they take a lot of damage. And some of them don't have all that reliable recovery. Say, Muck, for example. That is an example of a mon where it's okay, you do check in Rotom, but when it's behind a sub, it's just annoying to have to handle that. Or something like Cacturn, where you're not the bulkiest Pokemon ever, and a lot of Cacturn do run a minus special defense nature, so it's hard to keep up with them for the whole battle when you keep taking like 30% even from unboosted Thunderbolts. And then we got Zoroark up to S-, which is a little surprising to me, but it is a really, really potent wall breaker. For all the dark resists we have in the tier, Zoroark can still just pivot out with U-turn or cripple them with a trick, and a lot of them aren't too good after that happens. What I will say, and why I wouldn't have risen Zoroark up to S-, I think Bombardier picking up a lot more usage now, particularly for bulkier sets. I do think that hampers Zoroark a bit. Yeah, you can always pivot versus Bombardier, but I'd say Bombardier is a really good example of a mon that Terra enables super well to respond to those pivots. Because what are you bringing into a Bombardier? Maybe something like a Rotom that's faster, maybe even like Conda, if you're just trying to have something that won't get, you know, hit really hard. Something like Rotom doesn't want you to tear ground in its face. Conda, I mean, Stone Edge isn't going to one-shot you or anything. If it has a Glare, oh well, it's revealed its set, and you could still get the knock on it. So like Passimian doesn't want to try to revenge kill you, because it could potentially get knocked and lose all of its speed from Scarf. And if Bombardier is Brave Bird, that is a very easy two-shot. Knock into Brave Bird, picks off Pass. So I don't love Zoroark as much as everyone else, but it's hard to refute how consistent of a breaker it is. Especially in a tier where, yeah, you do as a Pokemon struggle to get into the field yourself because your bulk's so bad, but there's so many pivots that pair well with it that it doesn't really matter. And then we got a couple Pokemon going up to A, and I'll throw Appleton in here too, because me personally, I voted it to A, but it only went up to A-. Cacturn has continued to solidify itself as a genuine meta presence. For a long time, it was kind of stuck at that B+, A- threshold, because I think people were still saying to themselves, yeah, but it's a Cacturn. So for all of the good traits it offered, particularly defensively, and just strong Sucker Punch, I think it was a really hard sell still to people that you look at this meta, all of the Pokemon that are in it, and then you look at Cacturn. It's very hard to convince people that, yeah, no, this is actually just a really, really solid Pokemon. And throughout NUPL Week 1 and even Swiss playoffs, we're seeing heavy-duty boots with Leaf Storm, Dark Pulse, Sucker Punch be pretty consistent. We've seen kind of bulkier sets with Spiky Shield as well get use. Lets you scout out Pokemon like Passimian really effectively. And as I mentioned defensively, it's the same stuff you've always done. You're a surprisingly decent Bruxish answer. You are resistant to Dark, so Zoroark can't just spam Dark Pulse against you forever. And as a hazard setter, you don't have the worst Lurantis matchup ever. It's still not good, because as we mentioned earlier, Cacturn does typically run those minus special defense natures, and Lurantis does a lot of damage with boosted Leaf Storms. But it's not like Sandaconda, where you have to worry about Lurantis hard switching into you and then just defogging away what you set. So that's pretty helpful. And then, as we mentioned too, Sucker Punch, strong priority, is always really useful. You look at a lot of the Pokemon in this tier that you can pick off with a Sucker Punch, i.e. maybe like a Rotom or a Haunter. Even just a weakened Wall Breaker if you need to, like Bruxish. You don't even need Brux weakened, but yeah, you pick off that too. And Leaf Storm is super, super cool because, yeah, Pass can't just freely switch into you, hoping to, at worst, maybe take 35-ish from a Seed Bomb. Leaf Storm sends you back. Then we got Haunter. Haunter rising, of course, because, again, Muck is rising so much. And generally, Haunter can take on Muck, so long as it's not Zen Headbutt. It's otherwise just a really hard mon for teams to switch around, because in terms of bulky Dark types, it's like Umbreon is the only one. And you gotta play around with Poison every time you switch in because of Sludge Bomb. You gotta play around it having Trick and a choice item and making you just a lot less useful as a Pokemon. And the Sludge Bomb Poison thing really applies to all of them. I mean, Bombardier doesn't want to take that. You don't want to take damage at all with a Cacturn or a Zoroark against Haunter because you're just not bulky. If Muck ever goes for Terra, yeah, you don't want to get poisoned by that. You don't want to get hit by Sludge Bombs if you're Terra Dark Quill because you're not bulky enough, especially. And then you look at some of the just general special walls in the tier. I mean, Chansey isn't taking you on. What's Chansey got for you? T-Wave? I might be sub. I might be taunt even. Like, I almost forgot. Does Haunter learn taunt? I'm 99% sure it does. Ignore me if it doesn't, but it's fine. So Chansey loses to sub, of course. If you trick it, it's not happy. It can get encored into a useless move. There's just a lot of mons do not play very well in the Haunter, but I would still say specifically what makes it so hard to deal with is offensively. I mean, the mon just hits so hard. And because of Sludge Bomb's poison threat, nothing really wants to switch into you too many times. And Lorance is up to A because just like Scyther, it's one of the top 2 defoggers in the format at the moment. It's one of, just like Scyther, it doesn't offer a ton of momentum loss, which I think is pretty big, compared to Drifblim, where Drifblim kind of lets half the tier in for free. I mentioned this, I believe, in a video we uploaded a couple days ago. At the very least, Lurantis has Contrary. I mean, you are threatening opposing teams with a mon that gets exponentially stronger each turn, which is a really good dissuasion tactic. And with Terra, you can threaten a lot of the mons that may want to come into you, like, say, Scyther or Driftblim or Oricorio. They do not want to risk getting Terra Blasted. And Appleton, I'm going to keep it a stack. The reason I voted this up isn't even for, like, specially defensive sets. It's for Specs. Specs Appleton is great. Remember the video where I... shoutouts Fatherishi? I don't know how to say her name, I'm sorry. But shoutouts to him for trying to tell me why Specs Appleton's bad, because I'm here to tell you, sir, that take aged terribly. Specs Appleton is such a problem because teams don't have steel types unless something uses Terra. Otherwise, teams are hoping they have, like, maybe, again, on the other side, a fairy type, which that requires you to Terra, because we don't have those either. Or you're just hoping, okay, what if my AV Eel switches it? Oh, I took almost half. Great. What if my Muck... Oh, my Muck just took 50 from Draco plus Spike? Wow, how pleasant. Oh, but it's okay, I have Chansey. Oh, wait, I'm using Apple Acid. No! Also, I'm using Chansey, so I have a mon that gets abused by almost everything. It's a really hard one to play around. If you have not used Specs Appleton yet, if you're still on the train of Dragon Tail sets, drop that, make it Specs. I don't care if it doesn't fit the team, just try it. See the damage, it's beautiful. And when we talked about at the beginning of the video, mons that maybe rose due to living in the moment, a Glaceon to B-. Really, guys? We're doing this? Nah, Glaceon's actually, though, pretty decent. Again, we're talking about anti-meta wall breakers. Ice types are definitely up there. We saw a Sneasel use as well this week, I believe, from ZS in his best of 3 slot. Just like we talked about with Appleton, there are not steel types, so Glaceon is very, very easy to wall break with. You talk about the other options for ice resists, well, the fire types in the tier aren't bulky. And the one that is, Camerupt, is not resistant to ice. You talk about water types, of course. Well, for starters, we've got one specially bulky water type in the tier anyway, and Vaporeon is going to get packed up by Freeze Dry. So that's not too good. And all the general special walls that otherwise might try to switch into you, bar Chansey, are not consistent. Because you're either something like an Appleton, which gets tabled still by an Ice Beam, or you're something like, say, an Assault Vest Electros, and you do not have consistent recovery. Or you're like Umbreon, and, okay, you take Ice Beam, okay, but you're really just forced into spamming Wish Protect repeatedly, which isn't really that conducive to winning long-term. Now we go to the drops. Vaporeon drops to A+, and we also saw... Oh, I was gonna say we saw Umbreon drop, but I guess it didn't. I thought Umbreon dropped, okay. Well, Vaporeon drops, because Wish Pass teams aren't really as common as they used to be. I think people have kind of gotten into the mood of not wanting to put Vapo, or Umbreon really, on a whole bunch of teams because they're really easy to take advantage of. It's like Chansey and Driftblim, which we also see dropping, where they're not very hard to exploit. These are mons that commonly only have one attacking move, and there's either common immunities to it, or common, you know, heavy resistances that do not care about the other things you could do versus them. So like Vaporeon, you're seeding free turns to a plethora of Pokemon. Appleton, Cacturn, Toxicroak. Even Clawitzer, if they want to go Claw, they could try and force you to Terra always. You know, what does Clawitzer care about Dragon Pulsing versus you and making you burn Terra? Okay, you Terra'd into a Fairy type? Great, I'll come back in later and I will use Sludge Bomb or Flash Cannon instead. And the meta, I don't want to say it's necessarily trending more offensive, but it is trending more offensive. Again, that's why we talk about Scyther and Lurantis as being a lot better of defoggers nowadays than, say, like a Drifblim or Ikorio, where they just don't seed momentum the same way. And having mons like Vaporeon that kind of just sit around doing nothing isn't that great right now. And as we said a whole bunch about that with Vaporeon, it applies the same with Drifblim, where it seeds too many turns, and it just kind of sits around and gets abused by a lot of Pokemon. Qwilfish dropping, this one also kind of shocked me. I don't know why we dropped Quill, but I would guess a lot of it has to do with Muck and Haunter Rising, where their mons, I mean, yes, Quill checks Muck, but it's just Muck is viewed as the more consistent poison, and you're not going to run both Quill and Muck on the same team. Same with like Haunter, where you're not going to run Haunter plus Quill. You'd rather have Haunter plus Cacturn if you want that Spiker. And Cacturn is kind of, through week 1 of a new PL, shown itself to maybe be the better Spiker at this point, as its traits are just a little bit nicer. Qwilfish is a little bit shoehorned, at least defensively, into running, you know, like Waterfall, Spike, Toxic, Protect, or Taunt, Toxic pretty consistently, or Dual Stabs, Taunt, Spike, but it's always a little passive, I guess people don't like about it. Again, it's hard for me to talk too much about why Quill is dropping, because I don't really agree with it at all. I think maybe the biggest issue for it would be longevity, where, at least with something like a Muck, you can run Rest if you really need it, or Protect is easier to fit on Muck. With Quill, we see a lot of people run Helmet on it, and anyway, you're knockoff fodder pretty consistently, so you're not keeping a potential leftovers if you wanted to try that. It doesn't learn Pain Split right now because of the move pool changes, and I don't know if it ever gets Pain Split back in home. And so it's just kind of easy long-term to overwhelm. Think about all the PS lives I've done with Qwilfish. The Passimian sequences or the Bombardier sequences. A lot of time what happens is the first time Quill comes out, it gets knocked, we don't get Poison Point, and then it's like 2-shot the next turn. It just kind of ends up being glorified death fodder / poison fish fodder. And that's not the most consistent. Chansey dropped, I'll be honest, I also disagreed with this one, but it, you know, same thing applies to it that did with Vapo and Drifblim, where it's just, as good as I think Chansey is, it does often seed turns. And it's hard to sell Qwilfish. It's hard to sell Chansey to the masses in an offensive meta. Though I do really like this mon still. I think if we're looking for Stealth Rock setters not named Sandaconda, Chansey is still super good. So don't take this drop to A- as people saying Chansey's like fallen off badly. It's just harder to use, I would say, in general now. Mabosstiff falls. I could have dropped this even lower. It's very strictly outdone by Zoroark. I think it's even just worse than Bombardier if you're looking at offensive sets. The Mon does not do damage. I mean, look, I'll scroll down to Togki's reasoning, because this is what I've said before. Without Stakeout, this thing hits like a wet napkin. It is just not strong. You're looking at a Mon, even though it's got 120 base attack, which is really good, Stakeout is still where you get your damage from, and your moves are all like around that 80 BP threshold. It's not good. That's really just not good. And so, you're talking about mons like Sandaconda, you're talking a lot of mons that can Terra versus you. You better be forcing switches if you want a wall break. And even against mons you may force a switch from, like, say, Drifblim, or I mentioned Chansey, or Haunter. You have to be Scarf to force the Haunter switch, but again, like Rotom, you essentially just Terra and then say, okay, I stayed in. So now you don't get Stakeout, and I stayed in versus you and turned into a Fairy type, so you don't do damage. It's not a good angle. Then we see Berserker down to B+. It's people just haven't decided they think we need Steel types. People are very content to run something with Terra Steel, or even just like Terra Fairy, because they're pretty similar in terms of defensive profiles. People are happier to just run like a blanket special wall. I mean, again, like Appleton really comes into the picture here, where you're still a special wall that checks a decent amount of things Berserker would, special defensive-wise, and you can just run Terra Steel if you want to be a Steel type. And all of a sudden, you're a much better Steel type, because you're bulkier, you've got a great amount of longevity, you can still do, like, you know, Dragon Tail stuff. You're not passive because of Leech Seed plus Apple Acid. You're just literally better Berserker, and all it cost you was your Terra. And we see Camera Up drop all the way to C+. I think part of this has to do with the fact Fire-type wall breakers aren't too common right now, even though they probably should be. But also because using Camera Up means you've made a conscious decision to not use Sandaconda, and that's hard to sell. In theory, Camera Up should be kind of decent right now, if anything, with Vapo usage low, but maybe it's just something people need to turn their attention back to. Rotom Fan dropping, frankly, just no one uses it. I don't have really much to say. It's like, why use Rotom Fan when you could use Jolteon, which is a ton faster, and it could take over games so much easier as a result. Rotom Fan also, of course, no Pain Split, so it can't really switch into knockoffs either, because, okay, now you just take too much from Stealth Rock. It's not good. Vespiquen continues dropping, because it just is usurped fully by Quill plus Cacturn. Sawsbuck drops a little bit. I will say, there was an NUPL game last week, or yesterday, technically, where Sawsbuck eviscerated someone. It was a sub-Sword Stance set with Trailblaze, and we saw a great example of why Drifblim is not real. The Drifblim was Mono Hex instead of Air Slash, and it was turned into setup fodder, because what are you going to do when the Sawsbuck's behind a substitute? Nothing at all. Zangoose continues dropping. This has got to be one of the most fake Pokemon ever. You either run Belly Drum, and you never get a chance to set up, because you're too frail, and you don't actually force anything out if you don't reveal Toxic Orb. Or you are Toxic Orb, and you're still not strong enough to beat, say, Sandaconda. Or, you know, take out a Passimian if it's Scarf. You know, you gotta still play that whole lure game with potential Terra Ghost. The mon is awful. Basculin drops more because, again, why would I use Basculin over a Clawitzer or a Bruxish or even a Swords Dance Quill? Zard drops because it's frankly just outclassed by Pyroar, and there's nothing unique that it does. Keep in mind, though, with Pokemon Home, it does get Roost back. So, I ain't saying it's gonna become meta once it gets Roost back, but I am saying it's going to be meta, and you should prepare for that. I do believe that. Anyhow, Croc drops more because this mon is terrible and does nothing on a game-to-game basis. Doxbun drops all the way to C, because this mon is a terrible Wish Passer, and if I want a Fairy-type Wish Passer, I'll use Terra Fairy on an Umbreon or Vaporeon. Honchkrow to C is a little surprising, but at the same time, why am I using Honchkrow over Zoroark, or Bombardier, or even Braviary? Skuntank probably should have dropped to C+, but it's just kind of mid. It doesn't do anything necessarily that well, so people don't really find a reason to use it. It's like that weird compromise between wanting to be both a Quillfish and a Muck, and even throwing in a little bit of Bombardier to the mix. I've run into Nasty Plot Skuntank from Hoenn Confirmed on ladder before, and it's honestly not that bad, but you know, is Nasty Plot Skuntank enough to carry its viability? Me personally, I haven't seen enough from it to say yes. Spiritomb to C+, it's basically the same issue with Crocolore, as it only fits on Stall, and as a result, with Stall being non-existent in the meta, outside of the rare game it gets used here and there, it's just not a mon that's worth using. Crotomb is okay to keep it, NU viable, but it's not, good. And then we got some unranks. Masquerain and Oricorio P are both just bad Quiver users. And then even attacking the Sticky Web niche potentially here. Sticky Web's just not good. And then Quaxwell's unranked, as this mon is terrible. It doesn't do anything well. If I want hazard removal, I will run something that does actually threaten my opponent when it's on the field. And it's just also not bulky. You know, a Violite is not enough to make up for this thing's stats being, that of a middle Evo. So yeah, that's the VR update. I don't know if this will be the last one before Pokemon Home, because now we have literally no clue when Home is even going to be released. So we'll see. maybe we get an update again soon for when Home is actually going to be released, and then we can go from there. Now, I hope y'all enjoyed this coverage. If you did, of course, leave a like. Subscribe if you're not already subscribed. I'll catch you next time. Peace.